Hi, and welcome to Fabric Fodder 4. Wow, say that one fast 3 times. In this video, I will be showing you different techniques on using acrylic paints and acrylic gouache on wet fabric. These techniques I many times use as more of a background behind either dry techniques or things like stamping and stenciling and that. So these first few things are kind of like, oh, mainly because they're kind of the base layers for many other things that are potentially coming up. So again, it is so hard to kind of pull myself back and not just keep going with these in order to show you what they can become. So I have my list here so I don't forget. Now, I do have coming up in Fabric Fodder 5, which will be before Friday Fabric Fodder a week from now, because I just can't wait. One of my favorite things to do is to create faux rusted fabric. There's a lot of controversy and a lot of people who talk about, and I'll discuss this more when I'm doing those videos, about using the metal and the oxidized iron that creates the rust on fabrics and how it can, over time, damage and actually destroy fabrics. Not as much with paper. So I've been playing with a lot of different techniques and ideas of how to give that same look and effect on fabric without the metal issues. So again, I'll talk about that a lot more in that upcoming video. One of the things also too is I will be starting to create projects using some of these techniques, and I'll be showing the finished projects. One of the things that I've been thinking about is potentially starting a subscription, much like a Patreon, or I might do it both on my website, the subscription on my website and a Patreon with the same content in it, if you're more comfortable with Patreon, of behind the scenes using these techniques to create the projects that I will be showing. I tried a Patreon a couple years ago, didn't really work great for me, but I wasn't using it in this same way. It was much more of a complicated thing that I was doing. So I'm hesitant, but I also know people want to see how I'm using these. And by doing a Patreon where it's a couple bucks a month, it helps me to fund being able to do that. So anyway, if you're interested in that, give me a shout on the comments. But after we do the rust, the faux rust, we will be moving towards more stamping and stenciling, and then sky's the limit from there. Like I said, I have a list now. The list is up to about 83, I think, different ideas for videos that we can do using these different techniques of painting, etc., onto fabric and then turning it into projects. So we're creating fodder. Right now we're creating the basics for backgrounds for other techniques to go on top of them, and I have to cough. Excuse me. So anyway, enjoy the videos today. Some of these are just absolutely the most fun to just sit and play with. And the intent of all of these technique videos is not to be what I'm creating is something special in and of itself, because it's not a completed project. It is the fodder that you use to add layers to, combine with other things, and that to create those cool fiber, textile, mixed media projects and books. So I'm excited to get to the point where we've got enough under our belt that we can start moving on from there. Right now, we're still in preschool. Then we move on to kindergarten. So I want to jump ahead to graduate school, but I'm holding myself back. So anyway, hope you all enjoy this, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and then leave me a comment, and we'll see you soon. So enjoy. Today we're going to be talking about using acrylic paint on fabric, but this time we're going to have a wet fabric background. This is going to give much more of a watercolor type effect and is great for creating kind of a mushy, blendy background that you can then do other painting techniques or other stitching or incorporating it into a quilt. But it gives kind of that watercolory, blendy kind of look. So to start with, I put just a plastic garbage bag down on my surface because this does get a little bit wet. So rather than totally soaking your cloth that you may have down on your work surface, it's better to go ahead and just use an open garbage bag. I know it's causing a little bit of reflection and stuff with my lighting, and I apologize for that. The other thing you're going to need is, I tend to use a spray bottle for water to wet down my fabric. Now you can immerse it, in other words, run it under the faucet or put it in a bowl of water, but I tend not to have a bowl of water here on my desk when I have two cats who think, you know, living in the sink is the greatest thing in the world. So I tend not to do that. It's just a disaster waiting to happen. So I like to use just a spray bottle of water, and one of these big, large size like you can get at the grocery store. Means you don't have to fill it up as often, but you can use a smaller one. Now I do have a slightly smaller one that I have put in my fabric medium, and I put in my fabric medium, it's about 1/4 to 1/3 of fabric medium to water. I know some people will do half and half, but I do 1/4 to 1/3 because then I will spray this as well. I wet it with the water, but I'll put some of this on there as well, kind of just to, it's almost like a primer for the fabric to hold the color a little bit better. Since I'm not necessarily going to be adding this into my paints by spraying it on, it helps that as well. But the water does help the paints to kind of flow and blend a little bit better. Again, you can spray it or you can immerse it. Either way is going to work. So, excuse me, with this first one, we're going to do one main color. And I've got some little samples. Now, I have cut my fat 1/8 pieces into these smaller pieces for sampling. It's also a great way when you're first trying this out, rather than using a larger piece, it's far less intimidating to just have this little, it's like 4x5 type of size. And so it's just a great way to, when you're first starting out playing with this, and you can still use them on your project, whether it's in a mixed media book or a quilt or some other stitching type project or something. These are still usable sizes. So with this, as you can see, it kind of gives a real watery color effect with the paint. Now I do need to grab, of course, did I put it out? There it is. Meant to have everything all out. I need a palette paper to put my my paints on. And I'm going to be using a variety of different acrylic paints just to kind of show you with these techniques how they act differently. So let me just run through those. So I'm going to be using just, some of them are just, you know, my regular acrylics. Some of them are going to be the golden high flow acrylics, as well as the golden fluid acrylics. And you can also throw in a few just standard tube acrylics and possibly some heavy body ones. So just your typical acrylic paints that you may have or you may have decided to invest in. So I'm also going to be using on one of them some of the Paper Artsy Fresco Finish because they tend to blend a little bit better, I have been finding. And I'm also going to show you using some acrylic inks. Now, these are acrylic inks, not other kinds of inks. So make sure they're acrylic inks for what I'm going to be showing you we're going to be doing. So to start with, I'm going to use some water. Just spray it. You don't want it like floating on your table, but just to where it's just nicely damp, and then I'm going to give it some spritzes of the water medium blend. Now you're going to want to have some paper towels available because this does get a little bit wet, and make sure your work area is outside the spray zone. So in order to do a kind of single color like I've got here, and then I've just added some little accents to it afterwards, just add a little acrylic paint to our palette. And then I'm going to use a wider brush. Now I'm going to wet down my brush in advance. So you want to make sure you have your things of water, but it'll help it to spread it around a little bit if it's wet down a little bit. And just kind of brush it around a little bit. And then you can add some more water to it, and the water adding to it, like I showed you in that very first video, will help that to spread around. I also, because as you can see, it kind of flows through, I'll flip it over and soak up some of that. And that will kind of give you kind of an all over kind of color, but I kind of want it to be a little more blotched than that. So I can add some sections again, flipping it over. You can also flip it over on itself, that sort of thing. So it can kind of give you an all over. Oh, the other thing you're going to also want to have next to your desk surface is an old towel. Because when you are done and they need to sit and dry a little bit, you set them on the towel, but we want to add a little more color. Also, cat hair. You can also blend in a bit with your fingers. Now I'm not wearing gloves because the acrylic paint, I feel perfectly comfortable. There's some other materials that we'll use, or if you don't want to get it on your nails or your hands or anything, then by all means wear gloves like I talked about previously. So let's see, what's another not too intensive color here. Let's throw a little pink on there. Make it tiny, a little bit pink, just to give a little accenty kind of color in there. Kind of overtook it a bit with maybe blend it a little. You can use a brush or your finger. But just adding just a tiny little bit of accent. Now, one thing to remember about all of this is the color that you see while it's wet is significantly darker. It's going to dry about half as intense as what you're seeing here on this piece of fabric. So I'm just going to move that over, lay it on my towel, and that will soak up some of the water to where then you can finish drying it using a heat tool or your iron. I don't usually use the iron until it's pretty somewhat dry. Put that brush in my water. Now when I am using you get everything all set up, and then, you know, it doesn't always cooperate, so that you can have, like I said, this is not a well-oiled production. So when I'm using, now those were using just regular acrylic paints. I have found with the fresco paints, they do tend to blend the colors together probably a little better than some of the other ones that I have used. So I also have a brush that seems to have shed on these fabrics. So, okay, a little water, middle of my medium base. Let's throw some of these colors on there. Should have shaken them. Shaking them. tell I'm just getting used to doing videos again. You know, I used to do those live streams for all those years, 3 a week. For how many years did I do them? And I could talk for all those hours. It's just harder nowadays. I just kind of haven't been doing it much, so. I seem to be on a blue theme this morning. So I'm just kind of randomly throwing some paint on. Yeah, this is the brush that seems to have been shedding. Fortunately, it all brushes off afterwards. So let's just, that's mainly, I didn't shake the purpley one, and it's mainly just the medium as it had separated a bit. No worries. Mix it up a little bit. And brush it out a bit. Blend it in with your brush. Now, I will in the future be doing a whole section of using watercolors, but I'm trying, as I've been saying, trying to kind of stick to basics at this point. Here's a little bit more of a grayish blue to kind of blend in there. And then I'm going to spray it with some more water to help blend that. Rinse my brush out. Kind of just blend it together with your brush, but it gives you a real kind of watercolory background. If you want some, you know, highlighted, a little bit more intense color spots, you can do that. But you can see how this would be easy to do, especially with a bigger brush, to do this on a larger piece of fabric. So we'll lay this one off to the side with all those little hairies all over it. All right, for this next one, we are going to be doing a bit of dripping our paint on to create kind of a background. So again, water, bit of medium. I'm going to take my brush, wet it, put it in some paint. And you want your paint pretty wet for this, so you can really kind of drip into the background. You can pick up some other colors, maybe some of this turquoisey color. But again, I want it nice and wet. And you can do drips to where it all goes completely covered, or keeping it a little more subtle, just more of splattered. If you want to make it really have some intensity, you can drip from your fluid. So got a little turquoise, a little kind of caramely color, maybe do some Titan buff to add some neutral. With the fluid acrylics, which are, or not the fluid, the high flow acrylics, which are really intense but liquidy. And I then put a little spray on it, and you can see how they'll start to blend out from that point. So again, you can do these as intense or as subtle as you want. So I'm going to move that over to let that dry. It let it dry a little bit, but it kind of mushed it out. So I'm going to add some more of the blue onto it. Because I want it to have a little more color. There we go. That makes me happier, but those little splops kind of spread out. Versus on a dry, how would they kind of stay as little dots? But I like how they kind of bleed out. Okay, now I can set that one off to the side. Now this next one is where I'm going to use acrylic ink. The acrylic ink gives you the most intense, and you'll see when I show you this, because because I'm going to use pretty much the same colors, how intense it is when it's wet versus how intense it is here when it's dry. Again, wet my fabric down, put the medium on it, blend that out. This one have it nice and juicy wet. Now I've got a couple colors. It seems to be my blue morning, I guess. I have a couple colors. I have Liquitex acrylic ink and Daler Ronnie or FW acrylic inks. I've got fluorescent blue and green and Liquitex in dioxin purple and Prussian blue. So, and these have stoppers in them. And so you can get a little higher if you want. Let's see if you can get it to splat a bit. But you can see how intense that color is. And this purple is really dark, but it doesn't come out as dark when it dries. And again, these are acrylic inks. So I'm just squirting it on there, some direct, and then we're going to put some more water on it to spread it some more. And then just let it sit for a couple seconds. It'll keep spreading. Make sure you get your lids all on. I'll also pick it up. You can hold it, let it run a little bit, flip it over, really get it soaked in. It's dripping all over the place. So as you can see how intense and dark it is. Now, with this one, I do take some paper towels to set this one on versus on my towel, because it will, but then you can save the paper towel to use on some mixed media piece, because it really does. See how intense that is. Woo. But this right now looks pretty much how this did when it was wet. So as you can see, the intensity level significantly drops with some time. I want that still sitting on the plastic. I need paper towels. You could also just take an extra piece at this point. Spray a little water on it. Spray a little medium on it. And soak some of that up and get an extra one. It's going to be much more blended than the first one by using the soaking up the previous one. I love these Selecta-size paper towels. All right, so we can set this on there so you get a bonus one out of it. Now this one will get your fingers all purple and all that good stuff. Now, I do tend to save all these paper towels. Like I said, don't throw anything away. And I will use those on my mixed media stuff. I do that frequently. It's like, look at this paper towel. When we open it all up again. When that all dries, how cool, huh? All right, for this next one, bring in my piece of fabric, threads all over it, give it some water and some medium. And with this one, we're gonna let it just soak in just for a second. And with this one, kind of similar to the splattered drips, but with this one, we're gonna take a little piece of foil. We're gonna kind of create an all over pattern and then give it a spray again so it spreads all out. So I am also gonna take with some paper towel, just dab this so it's not quite so wet and more just intensely damp, for want of a better term. So I need a little piece of foil. It doesn't need to be anything very big. And you're just going to scrunch it up. You don't want to scrunch it too tight because you want some of that texture and sort of thing in there. So because I have this turquoise out, I'm going to use it. Again, just like I did before. Get paint all over it so you can just kind of, well, that's not what I wanted it to do. Get some more paint on it. You can also re-scrunch it. You want a little different texture or have different pieces of foil. So that's kind of cool, just like that. And with it being damp, it's going to spread a slight amount. But if you give it a little bit more of a spray, the more water, the more it'll spread. And it's also, the spread, it kind of develops. I don't know how best, it's kind of how I describe my sunburn when I get sunburned. When you first put it on, it doesn't necessarily spread a lot, but as it sits for a minute, for instance, this one looked very much like this at this point, but as it dries, it tends to spread those pieces out a little bit more. So you can also, if you want maybe a little bit more color in there, try to squirt out some color onto my palette, and it's not wanting to squirt. So I can take, even if it's, I'm not changing my foil, I can maybe add a little bits here with another color. And this is a good one if you're wanting to make larger pieces. And now with the second one, I'm not going to necessarily add more water on the top, or maybe just tiny little spritz. But you can see already how the blue has already started to spread, and the green will spread a little bit as well. But that makes for a kind of a fun all over pattern doing that. So for this next one, we're going to be using kind of a, what I call a scrunching technique, where I've kind of created a background with a softer color, with a soft yellow, you know, not, it's kind of an intense yellow, but it's kind of watered down and softer. And then I've taken a more intense color with the turquoise on top of it. So what I've done, because you're going to do your background first, what I've done with this one is I've used kind of a caramely color for the background. And how I get these little things in there is I wet it down. Let me do it on just a piece, and then we'll use that one. So on this one, I'm gonna wet it. Put my medium on there. Then I'm gonna take a smaller brush, and I've got some of the brown here. I'm just gonna spread it around a bit. Wet my brush and kind of blend the edges. Give a little bit more of a spray. And then what I'm going to do, so it's pretty subtle color. Maybe get a little bit of the stuff that's on the plastic. So subtle color, it's going to dry much lighter. But to let it dry, and this one requires a little more patience, you're just going to scrunch it up. And then set it to the side and let it dry. So I'm going to dry this off real quick. Because then what you'll have is it'll dry with these kind of variegations in there, almost like a batik fabric. So that gives some that, it's almost like a hand-dyed fabric, in fact. And you can do this as a technique to just create a fabric is just doing the scrunch it up and let it dry, because the paint will then migrate down into those low points. And so the valleys will get the dark and the peaks will not. So now I'm going to do a second bit of scrunching it. Once it's dry, I'm going to scrunch it all up again. I'll wet it first. Now, once it's dry, especially if you set it, it's not going to move what's already on your fabric. So I've done that. And again, I'm going to take a fresh paper towel and I'm going to give it just a dab so it's, again, intensely damp. So it's not wet, but it's not damp. It's kind of in between. So then I'm going to scrunch it, making sure that the front surface is, I'm not flipping anything over. So I'm just scrunching it up so that is all on top. Now, with a piece this little, I can just put this in my hand. And I'm going to take some of this turquoise and I'm just going to paint a little bit on those peaks. So then I can open it up. And at this point, I'd let it dry. I'm going to use my heat tool. I'll talk, but I can't put well, I'll hold it up in the air just to let it dry just a little bit so that it doesn't. Now you notice I kind of kept the turquoise. I didn't put more water on it this time around. So I just want to dry it as best I can. Everybody says when I do this that I have cast iron hands, but it's not really, the heat's not really coming through the fabric. And I don't need it to be dry. I just want to take the majority of the wet off of that turquoise paint. That's what I'm doing at this point. So that's probably about enough. So now I can take it and I'm going to scrumple it in a different way. So different parts are sticking up. Paint sticking to it, so. And then I can open it up again. And it kind of really gives a really cool mottled. And now I can pop just a touch, just to help some of that, especially the wetter turquoise, to spread a little bit. So as you saw on this one, some of the pieces are much more defined and some of them are a little bit more spread out. You can also scrunch it up to let this one dry. If you put, especially if you made it much more wet so that the turquoise ran, but we're just going to leave it laying flat. But it kind of gives a really cool, like I did on this one, it gives you that really cool mottled effect, which is great for some of the background type pieces. So this one that we started, even with that little bit, you can see how, I think you can see on camera, it's hard with, it's not, but you can see how it's already modeling up a bit. But I want it to be still scrunchy and just let it dry. The more patient you are in letting it dry, the better the peaks and valleys can be on it. So, all right, now we're going to move into a couple of different things. So we're going to use a dark fabric, a black, and I'm going to show you using some acrylic. I'm going to use some acrylic gouache. Now, gouache has been around, oh God, since the Middle Ages. Used to be, it was pigment mixed with, I think it was like egg yolk, the original gouache. Now, gouache, traditional gouache, there's two different kinds of gouache these days. There's traditional gouache and there is acrylic gouache. Now, traditional gouache is kind of like, almost like a watercolor, but it's much more opaque than a watercolor is. And traditional gouache can be reactivated much the way watercolor, watercolors, you have them maybe in your pan and they dry, you put water on them, it reactivates you and you can paint with them. traditional gouache does that same thing. With acrylic gouache, and this is just some Arteza, acrylic gouache does not reactivate once it dries. Once it dries, it's like any other acrylic. You can't reactivate it to paint with it. So if you're looking for gouache, make sure you know the difference whether you're getting an acrylic gouache or traditional gouache. Because if you want it to reactivate, you need the traditional. If you want it to be acting a little bit more like an acrylic paint, then the acrylic gouache is the one you want. Now with acrylic gouaches or traditional gouaches, they're much more of a matte finish than acrylics are. Acrylics have that kind of almost sheen to them that has an almost plastic kind of look to it. And the gouache is far less. It's kind of like the difference between this paint and the fresco paints, how these are much more chalky almost in their finish. Not really chalky, but more matte in their finish versus just regular acrylics have a sheen to them. It's the same sort of thing with the acrylics. And the acrylics, because they're intended to be an opaque kind of paint, they work great on fabrics. But what I wanted to show you was them on a black fabric. And what I love how they kind of get like a white shadow effect where the paint is thinner and it's almost glows on the black with the paint a little bit thicker. Now I did some with just regular acrylic on the same kind of fabric, and it mushes in a whole lot more. You don't get these kind of, and if I had gone over this again with a little bit more paint on my brush, I would have had more of these intense colors. But I really liked how I got these ghostly bits and then these little bright bits, whereas this kind of just, you can see the difference between the two. It's just a little bit more defined and a little bit more mushed on with the acrylics versus the acrylic gouache. So we're going to do the acrylic gouache. Now I want to have a brush that's a little drier. I'll go with this one. So a nice dryish type of brush. I'm going to get another piece of my let's just throw this guy in there. Let's toss this away. Another palette. Eventually the word does pop into my brain. And I'm just going to use some like 3 colors. In this case, I'm using 3 greens, kind of an emeraldy green, kind of a minty green, and a kind of olivey green. And again, my usual little water. Now this hasn't been pre-washed, this black. And as you can see, it doesn't soak in quite as quick. And you should typically, and I'm not big on rules, so I break them all the time. But you should pre-wash because it does sit on the top, because it does have a finish to fabric when you don't pre-wash it. But again, it works fine. You just sometimes have to make it soak in a little bit better. So I'm just taking a pretty relatively wide, not as wide as I used before, but a relatively wide. That one's too wide. That one's too big. Oh, this one will work. This is about the width, similar to what I was using. So I'm just going to take, with the one shade of green, this is one of my favorites. I use this one before in several projects. Okay, so that gives me that one green. Let's go to this more olivey tone. Put some of it. It almost looks like trees in like moonlight or something. And then I'll bring in some of that emerald. Now this is a fatter brush than what I used on this one, so it's giving me a little bit wider bits. It's also holding, it looks like, a little bit more paint, so I'll have a little bit more of those bright spots. But it's kind of cool how it does still give you that bit of ghost behind it. So this one looks more like bamboo because it was a skinny brush. I don't know where the brush, was it this one? It was a, no, it's not one of, it was a skinny wide brush, whereas this one kind of makes almost like this shape versus a flat shape. So the brush can affect how that looks, but using the gouache, you tend, I just like with the gouache how I kind of get that bit of glow and the kind of lightened shadow effect back behind them. So those are some cool ones too. So let me set this aside. All right, so for this next one, I'm again using some darker fabric. These happen to be some of my hand-dyed fabrics from like 5 million years ago that I just slowly have been using up because the colors that I hand-dyed are much more my kind of palette of being these kind of weird, complex colors versus the clear. I'm not big on bright, clear colors. I'm much more into the more muted, complicated colors and that sort of thing. Now, I'm going to be doing some dyeing and stuff this summer. I'm not necessarily I'm doing some stuff with dyes in this whole series, but I'm not necessarily doing a thing on dyeing unless, because there's 5 million videos and courses that you can take for dyeing. Unless people are interested in showing you how I do it. And that's something I am potentially willing to do as some sort of a course. Just because it would be very involved. It would probably be more late summer, early fall. The thing about dyeing is unless you have a great big garage that you can do it in, it works really well doing it outside in the summertime and such. So if that's something people are interested in and I get enough feedback that people are interested, I can consider it. But it's not going to be part of this free series that I'm doing anyway. All right, so for this last one with, again, a dark background, I'm kind of giving you a little bit of a preview of what the next video is going to be. With this one, I'm using one of my can lids or my jar lids to create, it almost has the effect of somewhat like rust. Now, the next video that I'm going to have coming up is about creating faux rust. And I'll be showing you how to, I'll show you all of these here. How to make faux rust without having to have a whole bunch of rusty bits. So that's going to be the next video that's coming up in the next few days. I have a book that I'm working on coming up. So I'm probably not going to be able to get to that rust video for a few days, but that one will be coming up. Because this is, I am so many things that I want to show you, and it's really hard to kind of contain myself and keep myself back from showing you absolutely everything all in one video. So anyway, but I do want to show you how these rings can be created. So they're almost like watermark rings or rust rings or something like that. So with this, I'm going to use a black and I'm mixing it with a bit of brown. Now with this one, or a dark, this is a metallic. So this is, I have micaceous iron oxide. I just call it mica iron oxide, and transparent brown iron oxide. And I mix those two together. So do that real quick. Not getting it on the green. So one is just a regular acrylic, and one is a high flow acrylic or a fluid acrylic. I can't keep them straight. My brain doesn't do well at keeping them straight. So I'll mix those two together. Look, that brush is kind of mushed up. And I want this kind of grayish brown, almost looks like rusty chocolate. And I'm going to just paint this on the edge. You can use any kind of circle or other shape that you want. This is almost like a stamping method. So, and I'm just blobbed it on. So I'm going to take, you can do a couple, and I didn't wet this down first. You should have yelled at me. Oh, wait, you're not watching this after I'm already done. So, this might be a little too dark on this purple, but we'll keep going with it. Maybe add a little more. You don't have to go all the way around if you're going to be going off the edge. And it's kind of make it like rings, or like you were using like a wire or something. Maybe do multiples. Again, give it a little wet so it blends out a bit. So I don't know if you can quite see that on camera, but they will show once it's dry, but it looks almost like rusty little circles on there. And then what I've taken just to add these little kind of glowing dots on there, I just used this bright kind of chartreusey yellow. It's called Nickel Titan Yellow. And I've just taken, I squirt it up so where it's just kind of coming out a little bit and getting that ring. And I always do odd numbers when I'm doing a set, because that your eye tends to, it gets your eye more excited when it's an odd number, because your mind and your eye tends to want to make it even, and so it keeps your eye moving around a bit. So then I get those little kind of circles. I can give a little bit of, that should spread them out a little bit. And again, once I get these all dry, at the end of the video, I'll show you what all these all look like, but dry. But those kind of give just that little glowing kind of thing with, and the mica oxide has a metallic, so probably can't see it on camera, but it has a glitter to it. So it kind of sparkles. So anyway, that is some techniques using wet fabric with the acrylic paints. So stay tuned for my next video, which I will be showing you how to do faux rust without having to collect rusty bits. All right, let's do a quick review now that these are all dry. Our first one was just painting and blending of a color onto a white fabric. I think this was the sample I showed you, and this is one I did. So you can see they do, when they're dry, they are a much more subtle color. Now these two were ones that I did with the Paper Artsy fresco paint, and how they blend together nicely. These next ones were the drip ones. This one where I had dripped some pink, and this one where I did the much more subtle color. I don't know which side I like better. Where I did the little bit of turquoise, some brown, and then the buff on there. Many times with these, I like using these for backgrounds and then do more defined type of stuff on the top. Now these are with the acrylic ink. As you can see, they're much more intense. This was the first one. This is one I demoed for you. And this one is really interesting. Remember when I showed you the scrunch and how the paint will go in the valleys and not in the peaks? I had this sitting on paper towel, and what it did is as it dried, the peaks of the paper towel left that texture on her. So little bonus extra, kind of cool. This was the extra piece that I sopped up on top of this one when it was wet, laid it on a paper towel. Cool texture. Now these were the scrunch ones. This is the one I showed you. This is one we did in class where I showed you how to do the scrunchy background. And here's that scrunchy background once it's all dry and flattened out. Cool, huh? Then we did the foil that we spritzed it so it spread out. This is the one I showed you. This is the one we did in the demo. Then we did the acrylic gouache on black fabric. This is the one I showed you with the flatter brush, and that's the one with the wider brush. This one kind of looks like bamboo in the dark. That one looks kind of like trees in the dark. And then I showed you this one in with the rings in the purple. It didn't really, you know, sometimes you get a dud. The purple was just too dark. It's not fully dry yet, so we'll see, but I kind of gave up on it. But this kind of gives you an idea of doing that. And we'll be doing a whole lot more of this, as I said, when I show you how to do faux rust without having to gather rusty bits. And that'll be the next video in the coming days. Anyway, hope you've enjoyed doing the wet fabric with acrylic paint. Thanks a bunch.